All right, I'm recording. All right, so what I was going to do today, I was going to go over one more time what I taught last week briefly, so you guys have an understanding of the framework, and then I'm going to keep building on that framework and bringing applicable data into it. So we're going to keep building on that, so you kind of have a kind of a visual and physical frame of reference when you're doing a lot of this work and shifting your beliefs and finding where those beliefs are anchored and why you might feel certain things in parts of your body. So we're going to keep building on that general idea of that circuit. So let me log in here to Zoom too. Oh, no, I'm good. Okay. All right, so I'm going to open up that image again. Oops, need to enable sharing. Oops, okay, where's this? Okay, so you guys should see some of these circuits that I'm bringing up here. Hopefully you can see those. Okay, so last week I kind of talked about what was on the inner area. What was on the inner area of this particular circuit. So what color can I use here though?
Pink.
Different. Let's use pink because that way I can mark on it without you seeing it. So last week we looked at kind of the inner area of this circuit, and I drew kind of what was on to the right of this pink line. So I'm going to go over this again, the right side. I'm going to tie into what's going on the left, and then we're going to kind of explain where the colors come from, what the colors have to do with color puncture, what the colors have to do with the organ systems, what the colors have to do with kind of how you would use them to balance the different emotional responses that exist at different levels. So we're going to kind of look at how this circuit sort of works in our physiology and how we might use it both moving forward, but also to kind of as an assessment tool from the outside in. So a couple of things. We start by getting information at our input. So we're getting downloads from our higher intelligence aspects, from our higher aspects of consciousness, from the, you might even consider it from the field of consciousness, whatever kind of fits with your current belief structures. There's a lot of different layers of truth to kind of what exists at these other levels. They're not important for us to have an applicable and practical picture of how to use this stuff in our 3D reality. And that's kind of where I want to focus right now is the 3D reality. So we get a download. That download comes from that quantum field in the form of basically a pulse code modulation, which basically means it is a waveform that looks like a square wave. Okay, and so we have basically a pulse code modulation that is sent as a digital signal. So in a computer that would be ones and zeros. In reality, when we have this sort of square wave, this isn't a 1 and this isn't a 0. That's not actually how even a computer reads that information. What it ends up being is a representation of logic high versus logic low. And those are actually created through a voltage. So this might be 3.3 volts, and this might be 0 volts. And so when it is within a range, your system registers that pulse code as a 1 or a 0, and then that gets carried through. Well, if you have noise in your system, this no longer gets read as 3.3 volts. This might be it might be noisy, and so you end up having this sort of signal in each of these different squares, and this starts to get rounded. So now you don't have a sharp edge that exists, and you have a square wave that might get a reading down here, or it might get a reading up here. It might get a reading slightly off time. So instead of it reading at the perfect moment, it's reading slightly before or after that perfect moment. And now you start to get misreadings of the information coming in. And so part of this game that we want to play here is how cleanly can we take this input signal. So if this is the input signal, how cleanly can we take this input signal and translate it into a result that we want. Okay, and so the idea here is all of this information here. We have, oops, where'd my eraser? All of this information here is created, so all this information is created from beliefs, from traumas, from old patterns that are, oops, that's writing weird. Oh, it's because I got goo on my, so anyway, so what I want you to just have a grasp of at the beginning is that this waveform is going to be generated based on the noise that exists in this circuit, okay? And so when we have a ground voltage, or root chakra, right? So when we have a ground voltage that is not stable, so our ground voltage, our root chakra, is going to deal with it's going to be where our cellular memory exists. So we'll have cellular memory. We'll have trauma imprints. We'll have kind of stress connections. You can consider it like our ground versus anything that can actually disconnect us from the ground. Beyond this ground connects to the planet. So this can be thought of as Earth or chakra 13. So this is Earth's core. And ideally, these two are connected. So we've got the ground that's connected to our root, which gets connected to the planet, and those end up cycling frequency as a 0 volt reference properly. So this up here, this whole waveform, the 0 volt is actually 0 volts. Okay, so we don't want this to read anything other than 0 volts. Otherwise, it changes the entire reading for the entire rest of the circuit. And that 0 volts is determined by the ground voltage that exists in these places. Okay. Now, okay. So a couple of things start to happen here. Wrong connect. Okay, so a couple of things start to happen here. When we have a ground that is not 0 due to different pieces of trauma, how do we start to track what part of us is dysregulated that might be causing this 0 volt reference to not be 0 volts, and therefore the frequency coming through our input, the purple, not to be translated correctly by default? Okay, and so what we want to end up doing here with our ground is look at, our trauma. So we all tend to know of our macroscopic trauma. So the challenges that we faced throughout our life. And those are a really good starting point, especially if you haven't examined them, because usually what happens is when we have this kind of experience, those initial experiences, whether we consider them a trauma or not. It could be the time that you really wanted that candy bar, or you were starving for food and you asked for food and your parents said no. And so all of those things can get imprinted as a trauma imprint on the root stability regions that determine how energy is referenced within your body. Oops, I'm missing some folks. Let me make sure everybody's here. Okay.
You see when people are trying to get in?
It showed up there. Is the only yeah.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, I was letting somebody in. So what ends up happening here is we end up having root stability issues, which are going to be tied to certain organ systems. So our root is tied to both our heart. So we want to understand that the heart is tied to that. So even the voltage regulator aspect is tied to that, but also our physical heart. We also have our kidneys that are kidneys and bladder, which are tied to the root as well, because our kidneys and bladder determine hydration, they determine electrolyte balance, and very fundamentally, they're going to determine how vital energy is produced in our body. So if we're dehydrated, if we have electrolyte deficiencies, like not enough salt in our diet, it's going to change that fundamental 0 volt reference for how our body can actually process information. So if our body is under stress, because we're running stressful metabolic pathways, so we're starvation dieting, we're not getting enough carbohydrate, any of these kinds of things are going to create stress in the kidneys. And so the reason that and that is going to then adjust that ground voltage. So the thing then, we have to understand that these are all interrelated and interconnected. So fixing one, when we fix the root, that doesn't mean that we fix the entire circuit. It also gives us additional information. So the next thing that I want to talk about is a little bit about interference patterns. So let me exit this for a second and I'll come back to it. Okay. All right, so there's a couple of things that happen. We have interference patterns when we add new information. So in our brain, we've got our hypothalamus, we've got the thalamus, we've got the pituitary, we've got the amygdala, and we've got the limbic system as a whole. The hippocampus and the limbic system, alongside the amygdala, from the time of conception, are taking snapshots of our experience. And so those are taking snapshots of every emotion we experience, of everything we see, of all of our senses. And all of those sensory organs tie into the hippocampus. And so that's kind of where that is unified in the brain. And so when we do things in color puncture, like the amygdala rhythm, or we do endocrine regulation, or we do some of the other treatments that are going to balance some of those signals, what we want to understand is what system we're actually refreshing. So the way that the limbic brain works in relationship to kind of multidimensional anatomy is it is taking those snapshots, and those snapshots effectively become a filter. Or a memory that gets stored in cellular consciousness. And so cellular consciousness then continues its death and rebirth process. And through that, based on that initial imprint that exists in the limbic brain, that determines how energy and emotion and reaction tend to flow through the system. And so when we do color puncture for those specific areas, we're effectively adding interference patterns to the rhythms that already exist. So stepping back for a second, let's talk about consciousness expansion. As we expand our consciousness, our circuit becomes more complicated. So one of the things that I said last week was that animals start with just their root chakra and their instinctual mind. So they just have chakra 1 and 2. And a lot of humans only have 1, 2, and 3 active, with their rational mind able to process both chakra 1 and 2 theoretically if they don't have splits and other things. So animals with their chakra 1 and 2 active are going to have less information bandwidth to process in real time, to kind of balance their learning experiences. As consciousness expands, not only do these higher energy centers begin to activate in a larger capacity, there's more information in terms of frequency and data that can then be processed by the physiological system. And so the endocrine organs start to evolve, all these things start to change as consciousness expands. Consciousness then expands to hold more frequency. Well, what happens when you add more ripples to a pool? You get more interference patterns. And we are always adding interference patterns while balancing the interference patterns that existed before. The idea behind color puncture, when we do these different colors, when we do these different reflex zones in the body, we are adding interference patterns to those regions to take a chaotic pattern and return it to a normalized, easy to understand symbolic pattern. And so what we want to start to understand here is kind of the concepts of what we're doing, both when we are saying, okay, this is where this mindset comes from. So we have a thought that we're thinking, and we then want to tie that thought to there's a couple of directions we can take it. We can tie that thought if it's a worry or an anxiety or a negative belief of some kind, or there's negative beliefs tied to it. We can start to track that back to the organ systems. And so the organ systems are going to relate specifically to different, let's say, levels of the body, or different components in the circuitry. And so when those different components in the circuitry are showing that they're off balance in some way, it's going to create a result in the cellular consciousness. And then that will change how the cellular consciousness forms into a group consciousness that we know as an organ system. Those organ systems then continue to expand their consciousness into larger organs. So first into the organs then expand into organ systems. The organ systems then expand into larger connected systems, and then that becomes the body. And then you have other aspects of things that start to co-create with those different aspects of consciousness. So we have our higher aspects of consciousness that interact with us in some way. We interact with our cellular through our cellular consciousness that has multiple levels of organization. And so through that process of understanding those levels of communication, we can start to use color puncture more proactively to bring balance to that circuit that I was showing you. So from a practical standpoint, when we're looking at our root and we're seeing especially right now with everything that's going on in the world, there's a lot of frequency that gets pumped into the grids. When we are walking outside barefoot and we're doing the things that the new age teachings call grounding, what ends up happening is we end up connecting to not just the ground, but the frequencies that are being pumped into the space between where we would connect to ground and where our ground reference is. So let me reshare this image and then I'll show you what that means. And so what ends up happening here, okay. So what ends up happening here is when we walk outside barefoot, we're connecting to the earth's ground, okay? And when we do that, there are other, whether it's EMF or it's toxins from our food, or it is, drawing a blank on all the things that they do. So mind control programming, all of these different things get inserted in here. Okay, and so what that does is that adds a bunch of noise to our signal. And when we have noise in the ground, all of this noise is going to become our ground signal. So if you think of these, even if it's a 0 volt reference or even if you have all of these different levels, think of all of these both as maybe a voltage, but also as a signal. And when we have noise at any of these different levels, that noise becomes our signal. So let me give you an analogy that is having to do with kind of an audio system, because it'll be easy to understand. So let me see. I'll just describe it. It'll be easier. So in an audio system, you have a couple of different components. And I'm using the same analogy because I started it last week, and I'm hoping if I keep repeating similar terminology, you'll start to grasp how I'm putting this stuff together. So in our audio system, we have multiple components that transform the audio signal from an electrical signal in one form to a mechanical signal that causes the piston in the speaker driver to create physical vibration. And so each component in an audio signal path is going to create a slightly different transformation to that signal so that it gets closer and closer to the electric format that will allow that piston in the speaker driver to move forward and back and create music or create sound. Your system, therefore, is only as good as its source. So if you are looking at an audio signal path and you're trying to change the amplifier, so, well, never mind, I am going to draw it because it'll be easier to draw blocks. Try that again. It'll make more sense to do that. Okay. And so what's going to happen here is anything that is okay. Okay. So let's say, let's do that, digital. I'll describe these in a second. I'm just going to draw it first. Well, I didn't say uniform. That's okay. Hey. So let's just look at it from this standpoint for now, because this will be easy enough to understand. So we have our source. Our signal can't get any better than the signal that exists at our source. So any noise that gets picked up as the signal is transmitted to different stages, any noise that gets picked up at the different stages, all of this becomes the signal. So if our signal is a perfect signal at the top, and then we add our noise, that perfect signal turns into that. And so this is the best. Oops, where's all my stuff?
It's an eraser.
So that is the best that our signal can possibly get. We cannot subtract the noise from this signal because this is the signal, okay? And so when we put this analogy in the context of how our physiology transduces information, we want to understand all the places in our system, whether it's the organs are out of balance or we have certain beliefs that are anchored at different energy centers. All of those are going to shift what our circuit starts to look like. So when we look at this particular circuit, when we have noise, we are adjusting this up and down. We're adjusting this, up and down. We're adjusting this up and down. And so that, instead of it being a perfectly flat line, becomes a line that is irregular. Oops. You get the idea. It's irregular. Okay. And so the clarity of our output signal gets muddier and muddier and muddier, as well as our ability to use our feedback mechanisms built in to process that information. So let's keep working up the chain. So the thing I want you to first understand is that when we have trauma, when we have noise, when we have beliefs that are unexamined, all of those beliefs that are unexamined, all of those traumas that are unexamined, all of our behaviors that are unexamined, and understand that these are multifaceted. So nothing is just a root belief. Nothing is just a, feminine output belief or second chakra belief. Nothing is just anchored in the heart. It's this circuit is interrelated at all times in real time. And so as we fix one thing, we're adding some of those interference patterns. And so to make this simple, if we have this signal, if I wanted to cancel this signal out, I would basically do the exact opposite, okay? And so what will happen here is the result of this, when they're canceled out, is a perfectly flat output, okay? However, this is not how it usually works. What ends up happening is you have this. Let's say this is the positive output. This is the thing you want to have happen. Well, then you have maybe something like this. And so these are not going to perfectly cancel out in any any sense of the word. And so if this side on the bottom represents the noise, we understand that this noise voltage that exists in the red here is going to subtract from the perfect black output that we have on the top. And so instead of this being a perfect output, we might then result in something that has less amplitude, less energy, less clarity. And when we have less clarity and amplitude at the output, it is going to be harder to read and evaluate and give feedback to yourself around the signals that we're processing. And so this is a big part of why why all these things are so multi-layered, and why I'm going to try and keep building on this concept a little bit as we go. So the next thing I want to share is the organ segments on the body. So let's do this. Okay. Where is it? Okay. So there's a lot here. I'm going to kind of break this down a little bit and give you some ideas, because there's a ton of information in this. A ton of information in this. And there's a lot of nuance for how we can actually use this. So I'm going to tie all the things that we've kind of just talked about into these different pieces. So let's start at the bottom. So at the bottom, we have the kidneys, and the kidneys form a triad with the heart. What ends up happening as consciousness expands, the lower energy centers are kind of rolled up into the higher energy centers. So the red, orange, yellow color turns into a aqua blue sort of color. And the heart chakra changes from green into a bluish color as well. And so a lot of those begin to shift their color spectrum upwards as this consciousness starts to expand. What we want to understand from this, and what I meant to point out on the other image, I'll go back to it, is all of these different colors are meant to balance. So if you imagine the sine wave that I created on the other image, if our goal was to have a perfectly linear flat output, then what we want to do is either add when there is insufficiency. So when the sine wave dips down below the level we want to add so that regulates up. And then we want to use, let's say, a cooling color when the energy is over-regulated or overshot, and then we can bring that back down. And so the goal with all of these different things is to understand not only how are they all interrelated, but when you bring one down, how does that shift some of these other energy centers? So starting at the bottom, we have the kidneys. So the kidneys are tied to your root chakra. So they're connected to vital energy. They're going to be connected to your electrolyte balance. They're going to be connected to the heart. They're going to be connected to fear, especially. So any of those root chakra programs and implants that exist, are going to be tied to all of that. So our cellular memory is tied into the root chakra. Our, oops, let me mute. Oops. Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of things that are tied there. So we've got our cellular memory from our past, present, and future selves. We have all of the imprints that were picked up from the time of conception all the way up until now. All of our imprints around abuse, trauma, shock, devastation. So I mentioned a lot of those last week. And all of those different imprints are going to create noise in that root chakra, which will then manifest in the kidneys and bladder. And so when we have root chakra issues, a lot of times it's important to, one, hold ourselves accountable. If we're having kidney issues come up, if we're retaining water, if we're having bladder issues come up, there is a root chakra stability issue that's showing up as well, that we can use either the organ to track backwards and start asking ourselves the right questions, or if we're working with clients, we can recognize the symptoms of things that are showing up so that we can start doing that balancing work. So most people think, okay, well, if it's red, they look at the dimensional color spectrum and they associate it just flat out. And the thing that I want to change in terms of your perspective here is that all of those colors in the dimensional spectrums are all interrelated and co-creating each other. So when you don't want to just say, okay, well, red is just for the first chakra and orange is just for the second chakra. That isn't true. That's not actually how it works. It will deal with that primarily, but that just is kind of the default that is, let's say it's the default direction that energy is going to flow in. So as an example, red and green tend to be the balance. There's a couple of colors in color puncture that tend to balance each other. And there's a specific reason for this. So red is going to be for insufficiency, meaning you need to upregulate the function of it. If there's weakness in that area, it generates energy. So one of the reasons that they do red light therapy, all that kind of stuff, is to treat insufficiency in those different areas. Now, it's possible, like I said, this is a regulation circuit to push too far, right? When you push too far with too much red, you're effectively going to create inflammation. And there's plenty of like photobiomodulation research that shows that. That shows if you do too much red, you actually start to create inflammation in the body, because inflammation or oxidation is one of the outcomes of mitochondrial respiration, so how they produce energy. So red triggering them to produce energy would explain having more energy in that area, would explain why that helps with pain, while at the same time, we want to understand, well, if we push it too far, we actually push it into the realm of inflammation, which is where green comes in. So green being the balancing color for that. Green is used then to downregulate, to balance the inflammation. So it reduces inflammation and things along those lines. So for infections, it's good. For inflammation, it's good. For cancer, it's good. People tend to use green to bring that inflammation back down as that balances. Now, if you, I'll come back to my circuit in a second to show how those balances start to work in terms of how that circuit actually operates in our body through as a feedback mechanism for what we're trying to create. So, so that's for the kidneys. And we can see there's a lot of different organs in here. And so really what I want you to get through this is the balancing that is done on each of these different organ systems. So the kidneys being tied to the root, being tied to the SI joint. So if you have a client who's having SI joint pain, you can check their kidneys and bladder. You can see glute pain and that kind of thing. And it's below the top ridge of the hip, but you can see that show up as well. The kidney poles may also ache. So if they have QL pain, definitely look at the kidneys and areas of their subconscious traumas, those kinds of things can help to rebalance how the kidneys are functioning, or check in and see if they're running on stress chronically. So that's where that comes in. The large intestine is you're going to see that on the glutes. You're also going to see that in L3, L2, L3. So intestinal issues, if you have low back pain in this area, a lot of times you're going to be seeing different inflammational states in the large intestine. There are ways of using your hand to scan for energy. And if you feel heat, if you feel cold or cool in some of these areas, that means there's a stagnation or lack of flow of energy. If you feel too much heat, it means there's too much energy flowing through or buildup of energy flowing through there. And you can start to look at that. So like I said, the kidneys are fear and stress. We'll see in the large intestine where you have focal intoxication. So focal intoxication is a lack of flow of energy, trouble letting go, emotional holding, meaning like let's say that you are being confronted by your partner and they're yelling at you and you kind of like just guard yourself up and your throat gets constricted. All that kind of stuff is emotional holding. And so you can also see when I'm holding that in my gut, it's also going to influence my energetic output in the other center, specifically the fifth center. And it starts to throw a lot of those things off balance and is going to start to give you a lot of feedback, right? So like I said, there's a lot of layers of feedback that we can start to get from all this information. When we look at this, I know it's colored in blue here, but generally the way I work with this is yellow and violet. So the large intestine, especially when there's an emotional component, is going to probably be colored in yellow or violet. Yellow would be used when there's a need to increase when there's an insufficiency, when movement is not happening. So red and yellow are tied together that way. Orange is tied together that way. So red, orange, and yellow tend to be colors that are meant to bring the regulation up versus violet, blue, and green are meant to bring that back down into regulation a little bit more if something is overactive. And it's important to understand how all these things start to interrelate so that you can start to shift multiple areas at the same time and bring those signals into better regulation, especially just in terms of your organ processes, because there's also going to be beliefs and beliefs that get stored in the cellular consciousness that forms your organs. And those beliefs are going to then manifest themselves in terms of how that organ actually functions. So next. So we have the large intestine. If we are finding that someone's constipated, we can use yellow here. We can use yellow also on the glutes. If somebody is having diarrhea, I know, Eric, I think the other day you said you had a client was having that issue, you would use violet in this area and that can calm that down. And so there's connections with yellow in terms of the rational mind and the higher mind. And so when we look at yellow connected to the third energy center, and violet connected to the third energy center, the thing we want to start to see is, well, I'll come back to this again too. So let me show you this one more time. What I want you to see in this image, where's the thing? Okay. What I want you to see is that there's two sides to this image, okay? One of the things that I was starting to piece together that I didn't quite get done is you'll see that the masculine output, let's do this. You'll see that the masculine output on this side is balanced by a feminine output on the other side of this circuit. The same thing goes for on the bottom. You have both of those balancing on either side. What I should have done for the yellow here is I think this should actually be violet. And so what we'll start to see is how this circuit starts to balance between particle and antiparticle, and then how you can see, okay, well, when I have negative beliefs, that actually shifts that frequency in this direction. When I have positive beliefs, it shifts it in this direction. And when I have conflicts between the two, I end up having a ripple that's generated in that signal that's constantly basically creating a tug of war in the output signal. And so we want to understand that each of these different aspects is connected to, it's going to connect to certain types of emotions. It's going to connect to certain types of actions. So our masculine principle is going to be inhibited in certain ways by the rhythms that exist in our feminine. So if the masculine output can get distorted by how willing we are to receive, our feminine input will be distorted by our perceptions around how much work we're doing, how much output we have, all those kinds of things. And so we can start to see how that starts to interrelate with how our output signal actually gets generated. We can then start to say, okay, which organs are then tied to the root? Well, tying them to the root, we have the kidney, the bladder. Well, those don't operate alone, right? So we want to understand that we also have a connection of the kidney and bladder to the heart. And the heart being able to be that frame of reference that can basically step outside of the circuit and look at the circuit and say, am I achieving the results that I want? Which areas of this circuit are out of balance? And so all of these end up getting, these get adjusted, because if our heart or our voltage reference or our comparator is not referencing an accurate ground voltage, or the heart is not communicating with the kidneys well enough, we could say, well, we have a stressed state and we are making choices on our output based on that stressed state, and we're going to get poor feedback as a result of that. And so it can be really important to start to see, where do all these things start to connect? Where do these things interrelate? Well, when we look at what organs exist at different levels, when we look at the orange color, so we look at orange and we start to see our sexual organs, our genitals, we start to see the large intestine is tied into our emotions and being able to let go, emotional holding, like I said a second ago, and the movement of that energy, all of that gets fed into that particular circuit. As we move up a little bit into our, like the throat chakra up here in blue, oh, lost it again. Throat chakra in blue up here, we're going to have our thyroid. So last week I talked about thyroid. Last week I talked about how to release the throat. We've got the physical aspects of how that works. We've got the energetic masculine principle output, the actions that you take. Now, if your actions are noisy and they are influenced by traumas and programs that exist on your ground voltage, well, the thing that you think that you're doing is not necessarily what you actually are doing. And so that gives you a new frame of reference to say, well, I think I'm doing this for the right reasons, but am I really doing this for the right reasons? And you begin to be able to shift that belief by tying some of these things together, saying, well, I think I'm doing the right thing, but my thyroid is hypothyroid, or my thyroid is hyperthyroid. Does that mean my adrenal systems are running overload? Well, what does the adrenal system tie to? It ties into the kidneys, right? So if the adrenal system isn't operating correctly, that's going to alter the thyroid response. The thyroid response is going to output the energetic output from the body, and that's going to change how the entire circuit is influenced. At the same time, we have the rational mind, which exists here, right? And the rational mind is that regulator adjusting those outputs. And it's constantly comparing the input to the output. It's constantly taking the voltage reference or the frame of reference that you set, saying, this is the desired outcome that I want, that I set with my heart. And then it's comparing the voltages that it's seeing and adjusting course. Well, if there's noise on the regulator, or the regulator's timing is not right. So let me show you the next circuit here. So what I want you to see here is this is the same thing that I just drew, but this is just a circuit that you would build into an electronics component. So we've got our root, we've got chakra 2, we've got chakra 5. Our voltage reference is the heart, so we got C4. Okay. Then we have our output signal, and the one thing I haven't mentioned yet is timing. So when I drew that square wave earlier, let's say that we have a register that is constantly taking snapshots, right? And so if you imagine that this square wave is moving this way and it, this continues. And then every time this square wave passes through this region, a snapshot is taken and that data is acted upon. Well, this timing that exists here, this timing is determined by the clock circuit, by the pulsatile rhythms of our subatomic particles. So the angular momentum of particle spin, our frequency state, so our state of frequency is going to determine the timing of our circuit. Now, if this timing is dysregulated because we have various types of distortion in our heart chakra, or we're still healing, or something is clearing, or we are not fixated, we are not properly fixated in our identity, we're going to start to see changes in our timing in our clock signal. When the clock is different, now we're going to then start reading at the wrong time. Okay, and when we read at the wrong time, we could say, well, actually, let me do that. So when we're supposed to read here, but instead we read here, did we get the same signal? No, we got a logic low where there should have been a logic high. We got a 0 volt where we should have had a 3.3 volts. Now add to that all that noise. The combination of two of those makes taking an accurate snapshot much more challenging. There's more layers, right? But if our timing is wrong, or our ideal is wrong, or any of these other signals are not quite working, have noise on them in some way, well, all of this different noise is going to influence the snapshots that we're taking and our synchronization with those different layers of the circuit. So let's come back from that for a second, hopefully. Okay, so there's a lot of pieces here. And so the high level concept that I want you guys to get is starting to see how these different layers interrelate, how you can start to use color puncture from a balancing standpoint, and how we can start to translate where our different signals are getting interrupted in terms of our ability to access accurate downloads. So bringing it back a couple of weeks, we talked about beliefs. And at each of these different segments, the way that our regulator in our heart, let's say, processes that information is going to be based on the underlying negative and positive beliefs that we hold. Those negative and positive beliefs, I don't like saying negative and positive. Let's say the collection of beliefs are going to either be additive towards your desired outcome, or they're going to be subtractive from your desired outcome. They're not positive or negative, they just are, and they influence your output signal in a specific way. And so it's really important for us to not be afraid of our own consciousness, in the sense that the negative thoughts that come up, the fears that we embody, the way that we think about money, the way that we think about our partners, the way that we think about how we should show up, the way that shoulds in general start to show up in our life. None of those are negative beliefs. Some people call them limiting beliefs, and that might be relatively accurate. But the thing we want to understand is that they are there as part of, we needed a circuit to start with that we can modify. And so as we expand our consciousness, we begin to understand larger pieces of the circuit. We start to see how those things start to interrelate. And that starts as synchronicity, right? We start to have an energetic awareness and start to see synchronicity. So we start to have a deeper connection to our emotional state or our intuition, and we begin to translate that more accurately. Well, all of those they exist all the time. They didn't just turn on. What happened was our capacity to hold that information in different aspects of our circuits expanded to be able to touch that amount, that type of frequency. And so as we do the healing work of examining our beliefs that exist at each of those centers, we can start to regulate that signal, and then all of the information that's coming through us gets translated much more accurately. So we always have an input signal. It's called a stream of consciousness, and that exists because we are awake. So when we are asleep, we have a different stream of consciousness that's pouring into a different aspect of our circuit. The dream self, those kinds of things that are pouring in a different direction for that universal stream of consciousness that is perpetual. It's eternal. And so there's never a time where, we're getting downloads versus not getting downloads. We are in the process of downloading. And the more capacity in our circuit we have, the more information we can hold, the more interrelated information we can hold, and the more connection to our imagination we have, the more we're able to then take that input information and process it in a new way. Well, if we believe that our consciousness is dangerous, if we believe that our subconscious or unconscious mind is a place of negative emotions or negative experiences, and that if we entertain those negative emotions and experiences, we create them, well, then it gets really, really difficult for you to reframe and reevaluate those underlying beliefs. Because what ends up happening is you're like, oh, well, I learned in the law of attraction that, positivity at all costs, love and light. I need to make sure that I am only looking at the positive. I'm only looking at the positive emotions in all cases, because if I look at the negative one, I am going to pour energy. I'm going to pour energy into let's say the wrong side of that circuit. And by pouring energy into the wrong side of that circuit, I'm going to create the opposite of what I want. I'm trying to manifest money. But at the same time, I'm outputting the lack of money. And so you're saying, well, I'm focusing only on the positive, thinking that focusing only on the positive is going to eliminate the negative, but it doesn't. So one of the things that I always had to tell people when I ran my audio business was, when you have noise in the signal path, that is the best your signal can possibly get. So you focusing only on the good parts of that signal that you see does not mean that there's not more information below the surface of that noise. And so when we remove that noise, we see higher resolution, we get more music, we get more resolution of data coming through, all of that kind of stuff. We do not remove that noise by ignoring it. So if I had a buzz that was coming through my speakers or a 60 hertz hum, yeah, I could probably tune it out and ignore it. But that's not the same as eliminating it entirely or balancing that circuit a little bit better. So what that means is, when we have these programs and beliefs around what we should be doing as a career, how we should interact with people, what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be a higher consciousness being, what does it mean to be not operate in lack and scarcity when you run your business. All of these different things hold a preconceived belief around what is abundance, what is scarcity. If you've never actually defined that for yourself, it's no wonder you haven't shifted those programs yet. And so if you run on those and you're saying, okay, I'm going to be abundant because I'm feeling scarcity right now. Well, you have to acknowledge the scarcity in what you're actually feeling. So when we look at scarcity manifesting itself in terms of why you choose to make a certain type of content, why you choose to put this product together to sell it really, really quickly, why you might leave a client and then think of 300 things you should have done with that client to make their experience better. All of those are scarcity energies, and we have to then reflect, okay, what part of me wasn't enough throughout this experience? What part of my belief structure says, in order for me to achieve my outcome, I needed to do more? And then we can start to backtrack those beliefs. We can start to backtrack those programs down to those root levels that said, oh, well, I only believed I was supposed to do that because, well, that's a strange thing. I never used to believe that. And then I started working on Instagram in a certain way. And as I worked on Instagram in a certain way, it caused me to create content in a certain way. And as I was perpetually creating content in a certain way, I adopted this program that was running that caused me to keep having to create this content in a certain way. And so it perpetuates an underlying scarcity that may not have existed in its same form when you were a kid, but is anchored in those underlying not enough programs that can show themselves in later times and in different ways, so that you can get feedback from your universe in terms of, how is your circuit actually working? Because so many people are like, well, just meditate and allow yourself to receive. So they're getting into their feminine energetic, and they're working on their emotional center. But a lot of the people who go that way have not done the masculine aspect of their energetic, which is the energetic output. And if you don't have an energetic output, you cannot sit in the feminine energetic and receive and then process and evaluate what that information flow was. So there is, because we live in a structure of time, even though these circuits all work simultaneously, we are constantly getting feedback that communicates between each of these different centers. And so these different centers are in constant communication up and down and left to right, side to side, and with each other, so that you as a human get feedback through the body of your beliefs. So when we have these beliefs that exist about who we are, how we should be, how we should look, how our body should operate, if we believe in illness, if we believe in what we believe illness is, what we believe wellness is, if we believe in abundance versus scarcity, and then understanding, okay, where do these actually get imprinted in these different energy centers and how they show up? Well, they start to show up, what I was saying, the kidneys, bladder, and then connected to the heart is the root chakra. So we can see, okay, if I'm having kidney issues, I'm having a root issue of some kind that I need to evaluate those aspects of both trauma and stability so that my ground can be normalized. Moving up, we have the emotional center. Well, what can cause emotional issues? Well, we have our sexuality programs that exist there. We have stuck emotions that we haven't felt. So if we have a lot of emotional division within us, if we had a lot of trauma, not only is that going to fragment the root chakra, that's going to cause a division in the emotional chakra that is going to cause the polarity of emotions that a lot of us have not quite integrated and been able to translate accurately yet. And so we're constantly having dramatic emotional responses to things because of that irregularity. And so we can start to evaluate our sexual being. We can start to evaluate the organs that are connected to that area, whether that's the large intestine. Do we have any gut issues? Does that mean we don't have any, we have emotions and things that need to be released, that need to be processed? Do we have, then as we kind of move up a little bit into the rational mind, we can see the pancreas, we can see the liver, gallbladder, we can see the spleen, we see the color yellow, so that's tied to the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system being the psychological buffer that is both translating information coming in, but also processing the information that's there. It's the rational mind. It's the control of the flow of energy through the body. So when you come back to my regulation circuit, that I had on the other thing. So the heart chakra being the rational mind and the heart chakra being the regulation circuit. As that expands, so remember what I said was animals were just first and second chakra, that was their circuit. Now humans get a rational mind, and so now they have a regulator that can adjust the emotional energies and start to adjust. And then we get the heart chakra, which plays into this, that sets a frame of reference so that the voltage regulator can start doing a better job regulating the voltages at those outputs. And then we get the higher aspects of the monad, let's call it. So you get the higher aspects of your avatar consciousness that comes in that activates the other centers. Well, now instead of your heart being alone in its regulation circuit, well, now you have the higher mind that gets tied into that. You've got the heart that gets tied into that. You've got the actual rational mind that gets tied into that. And now all of these co-create that regulation circuit by having more information. So, right, if the regulator, all it does is it says, okay, I need a 12 volt out, 3.3 volt output, and I'm getting this input, then I just need to reduce it down. And so it drops that voltage down to the level that you want. And then it just adjusts the output in real time based on the input fluctuation so that you get the linear output that you want. Well, that's slow, that's imperfect, it doesn't work at higher frequencies. So what do you need to do? You need to add a reference. And so that reference is, this is the ideal the perfect clock signal that we need. And so now you have that reference that can compare the output to the desired out. So you have you have a perfect output that you're using as your frame of reference. You have your actual output, and then your heart and the higher energy centers can start to compare and say, is this actually matching what I think it is? And then you start to adjust and you start to adjust, and you can start to reprogram and reframe and adjust all of those different structures at that level. And so when we look at the rational mind being that regulator, and when we have anxiety, when we have ADHD, when we have those kinds of issues, we are seeing the timing errors that exist in our regulator's ability to create a flat output. And so as the higher energy centers activate, that allows a regulation of those different circuits so that we can create a more regulated output, so that we have more peace and whatever else as part of our output. Well, what symptoms show up? So we could have ADHD or anxiety. Those are the mental aspects that show up. We can have issues with our liver, with our pancreas, with our gallbladder. All of these are energetic organs. All of these are regulation organs. All of these are enzymatic organs that basically, when you think of what enzymes do, they're converting. They're changing one form to another. They're changing one voltage to another voltage. They're changing, they're producing more enzymes versus less enzymes based on the demand of the circuit, right? And so these different organs, when they are having trouble keeping up with the output. So you're getting too much high frequency in, but you haven't healed and integrated your circuit. You have too much noise. Well, the regulator can't keep up. It oscillates. You have ADHD. You have issues with your liver. You might have issues with your sugar metabolism because your body is trying to metabolize energy, but the energy coming through is happening faster than what your body can keep up with. And so removing noise is the first step. Doing the activations and different things is kind of the tandem step with that. So that allows these other aspects of your circuit to come in and reevaluate and say, okay, well, I'm seeing these ties. I'm seeing, oh, my rational mind is connected to my masculine output also in this way. So if my thyroid is hypothyroid, meaning I'm not having enough energy produced, I'm not having enough energy output, well, there's a direct tie to the liver in terms of how those organs are paired. So when your body needs to produce more energy, the liver enzymes upregulate to produce more energy in the thyroid, unless your energy input and those kinds of things are missing, or your programs are noisy and out of alignment, and that can cause a lot of those different distortions to show up. Okay. So what I want you to start to see, because this is going to be a long process of going through a lot of different things, and then we're going to go through specific beliefs as we go, is I want you to see the multi-layered nature of how these systems interrelate. So just because, at the simplest, we can see that there's organ pairs that work together, and the different organ pairs are going to communicate in a specific way. And if we then map those to the circuit, we get an idea of how those start to shift, how we output energy, how we receive, how our circuit works when one of those is way out of balance. Because if we output, but we're not willing to receive, nothing comes back to us. If we only sit in trying to receive, then nothing comes back to us. So we need to understand that you need literally both outputting and receiving to happen in simultaneously, so that can actually balance and work organically in our body. Now, let's see. So let's talk about kind of aspects of our personality a little bit. So I've talked about these a lot, but I'm going to keep repeating them because hopefully it'll help you guys follow and track this stuff a little bit more. So we've got our subconscious mind. In our subconscious mind, we have our cellular memory, right? We have all of our traumas. That's our root chakra. All of those traumas are then going to influence the cellular memory. And that cellular memory is going to live out a life. It's going to live out a life based on the frequency that we're sending it. And it's going to have a birth and death process and a rebirth process where it transmits memories to each of your cells and carries those programs on or not if you choose to reframe a lot of those underlying beliefs. That will be repeated, collect into collective consciousness of cells, which then can form disease or can form wellness, depending on the belief structures that exist there. The emotional centers are going to have a lot of, so the thing I want you to understand about the throat chakra and the second chakra is these are always active and outputting. They're always working. The question is, how much noise do they have? And so it's not like these are ever off. None of this stuff is ever off. What ends up happening is if you feel disconnected in some way, there's a belief that's implanted in there that causes the flow of energy not to function, organically through that circuit. Noise, right? Let me teach you guys a little bit about wires, because I think that'll be an important aspect to how these things actually work. I'm going to teach you about wires. I wasn't going to teach you about wires, but I'm going to teach you about wires. It's going to be simple.
Says Ryan Mintz.
It's not going to be simple. You guys aren't going to get any of it. All right, so wires. You've got three different, and actually I think this will be a good thing to learn. So you've got, so let's say we have a wire. Let's say that's like a speaker cable, right? You have a positive side and a negative side. That's the case with pretty much every wire. These usually look like one wire when you wire them, but if you were to like look at speaker terminals, you'd have two wires. If you don't get that much, it's not important. Just assume this is a wire like you would use to plug in your phone. These wires will exist in the same way that the wires that plug in your TV, all that stuff is carried along copper wires. So there's a couple of features of these wires that I want to mention. We have inductance. What did I do? Oh, I keep changing. We have inductance. And so what inductance is as energy flows through this circuit and then flows this way through this aspect of the circuit, these are constantly switching back and forth. So this will shift from plus to minus, this will shift from minus to plus, and they flicker back and forth basically to shift the polarity of the signal as it comes through. Well, inductance is the resistance. Well, I take that back. They don't switch back and forth, not in this case. So the inductance is the resistance to the change in the state of this conductor. So let's say that this ideally has no this conductor here has no frequency component. It's zero noise. Well, when you add noise, now it has a frequency component. The inductance is a resistance to this change. So what happens is when that signal wants to go up this way, inductance as a side effect of like electricity flowing through a conductor is going to create the oppositional electromotive force. So an oppositional force to this inductance, which is going to prevent it from basically going up as high. So if there was no inductance, that signal might go way up. It might do a much larger move.
Is it
right?
like a dampener?
But yeah, you can think of it as a dampener. So it basically limits change. Now, on one hand, limiting change is a good thing when we have a constant signal. If our signal is a rhythm, too much inductance actually slows the rhythm down. So we want to understand that these are not extremes. They all interrelate with each other. The second is capacitance. And that's the ability of this conductor to actually store a charge. So when signals travel down that conductor, some of the relationship of the conductor to the insulation is going to generate a capacitance that is going to hold a charge. And then So I'll show you on the other wire just because it's easy. It's not actually how this happens, but you'll get the idea. As this starts to move, this capacitance would effectively fill in some of the opposite. However, when you have too much capacitance in the cable, you end up actually rolling off the frequencies. So instead of that having the bandwidth of frequencies that we want, you end up filtering out some of the high frequency information. So when you have too much capacitance, you end up filtering out some of the information that we actually want. Both of these are inversely proportional. So as, well, is that true? It can be true. So the inductance and capacitance are going to interrelate. So when you have a lot more inductance, a lot of times, or when you have really low inductance, that usually means that you have a really high capacitance in that conductor. So there's always that trade-off. Like in audio, one of the things that they use capacitors and inductors for is for the crossover components in a speaker, which is what tells the high frequencies to go to the high frequency driver. It's what tells the low frequencies to go to the subwoofer, is how they use inductance and capacitance to determine those crossover frequencies. Well, there's one more component here. We have resistance. And resistance is the opposition to the flow of current in that circuit. So the resistance, if the top circuit is flowing this way, resistance will prevent the maximum amplitude of output from reaching its destination. And so that too is going to create noise. However, we need resistance in order for the circuit to flow. So let's, I do all this in one line. Probably did, didn't I? It's good enough. So, oh, I just lost my train of thought of what I was going to do there. Let me see what I was doing.
You need resistance for
Oh yeah.
energy
So
to flow.
So one of the things, so let's do a super simple circuit here. Let us draw. Anastasia taught me how to draw yesterday or the other day. So now
now you're a pro.
Now I'm a pro. So let's say that this is a circuit. So we've got plus and ground, whatever, that doesn't matter. The light bulb is the resistance. So that's the resistance, okay? The light bulb is the resistance. And a couple of things can happen. Let's do this. So okay, so let's say there wasn't a light bulb, which is this space here. There's no light bulb in this circuit. If there's no light bulb, there's no resistance. Well, if there's no resistance, there's no way to cross that gap and have a circuit that flows. Okay. The other thing that can happen is, actually, I take that back. That's infinite resistance. I'm backwards. So what happens here is because there's no connection between plus and ground, there's infinite resistance. So much resistance that conductivity cannot happen across that gap. So think about actions that you try to take where you feel a little bit of resistance to doing them, but you feel so much like if you're trying to lift 1,000 pounds, that would be so much resistance that you cannot accomplish any current flow through that movement. Now, when we look at the light bulb, having resistance on this circuit to a certain point is going to allow this light bulb to illuminate. If someone was to attach a wire from plus to ground, there would be zero resistance. If there's no resistance at all, the light bulb can't light up because the current flows right around it. And this is the case with everything in our life. Our resistance is necessary to allow current to flow into the thing that we want to create. So we don't want to build circuits that are free of resistance or that are set up as ease, so to speak, without any kind of feedback from the universe in the forms of these other elements that I was drawing here. Okay, so we have these other elements, this resistance that exists. We want just enough resistance in our circuitry, in our body, from minerals, from our hydration level, all that kind of stuff can create resistance. From our fascial structures, all that kind of stuff, from our electrolyte balance, all that changes the conductivity of the signals that come through our body. That gives us a little bit of resistance. That allows signals to flow. Now, when those electrolyte balances get out of whack, well, that changes the resistance in certain areas of the body, and that's going to alter the body's ability to process that information, whether it turns something off that should be turned on, or it causes it an insufficiency or an overactivity based on that level of hydration just to begin with. And then we have capacitance and inductance, which the inductance can be thought of as our resistance to changing our beliefs. And so when we want to change our mind, when we go to change our mind, we always have the oppositional force that shows up. So when we're creating a new belief around money, when we're creating a new belief around love, immediately when we start to generate that belief, we automatically generate an inductance or an oppositional force to that belief. And this happens by default. And that's part of why it's so important not to force energy into the positive belief, but to create the positive belief and then evaluate and examine the aspects that push against that belief. So digging into the negative aspects of those programs can allow you to surface the unexamined elements of inductance that we want to remove from the circuit, so the circuit can have a faster transient response, right? So we want the circuit to be as agile as possible, and having that kind of noise and inductance means you can't change your mind quickly enough. However, when we have too little inductance, our mind changes too quickly. And so we have too many, all these different things start to change, and we start to be inconsistent with our output, and we don't stick to anything. And so we need a little bit of inductance to make sure that our circuit flows in that sense as well. Now, when we look at capacitance in this scenario, these are imprints, right? So we have charges that are imprinted in our fascia, in our lymphatic system, from traumas, from beliefs, from programs. Well, those traumas, beliefs, programs generate capacitance, energy storage. When that energy storage gets to a certain capacity or level, it starts to hurt. And so because of the way that capacitance releases. So what we're getting here is we start to see how our bodies work as this electrical circuit, and where those different levels of the electrical circuit start to interrelate. Now we have our conductive system, we have the organ system, we have different tools to communicate between the two, and then we have our rational mind, which is constantly adjusting based on the signals that exist in our conductive system. And we have a responsibility to improve our rational mind's ability to process information. We have an ability to use our heart chakra and our higher intelligence aspects to step out of the game and evaluate the effectiveness of our actions. So not just thinking what our actions should be, not just wondering what the good, balancing good and evil, but really understanding, is the course of action that I'm taking, is my thought process, are my belief structures the most effective order of operations that I could be taking to create my desired outcome? And constantly holding yourself accountable to how you can start to balance those equations a little bit better. Understanding that all of these things interrelate. If we have a belief that our unconscious is hard to access, then we are going to experience a hard to access unconscious. And so there's beliefs even around how easy it is to heal, how easy it is to do certain things, that when we start to create the positive side of that belief, will reveal our own resistances, our own inductances in the way that we can adjust that circuit. So the wires that I was using in this analogy can be thought of as your beliefs, right? So how your beliefs pick up noise, or they're clean conductors. And our organ systems then are processing the language of those beliefs through the cellular consciousness. That then out pictures through your physical body and your identity and how you show up in the world. Well, there's a couple of things that have been done to humanity. So there's this psychedelic revolution there that alters how this regulation circuit actually works. And there's a lot of different chemicals that people use. So whether it's ADHD medicine or psychedelics, all of these different things are going to either cut off information. So they're basically going to be a frequency dampener of some kind that is going to limit, it'll give you the impression that you've reduced your anxiety and ADHD, but really all you've done is filtered out a tremendous amount of frequency. So it effectively creates a low pass filter, which is why a lot of people feel like they're disconnected from their imagination, they're disconnected from their higher intelligence when they take those medicines, just because it basically acts as that low pass filter that filters out noise, because your body is not, your regulation circuit, your rational mind is not fast enough to interpret the frequencies that are carried on it. Now, when we do psychedelics, we are opening up our entire cellular consciousness and fragmenting our rational mind. And so when our rational mind has a mission, the way that our rational mind works is it has an identity, it has an ego. And that ego is the point of focus from which all of those frequencies get directed. It is the chosen voltage of this circuit. And so when we do psychedelics, initially what it allows you to do, and this is why they have positive results from this, is when you do psychedelics, especially large doses of them, you effectively are breaking your regulation circuit open. You're breaking your cellular consciousness open. When that happens, a new ego must be born out of that experience. It is just the connection to the higher self, the higher intelligence, the inner self. By nature of embodiment, we will always, always, always have an ego identity. It just depends on the perception of that ego identity. So when we experience that ego death, you get the benefit of having that old voltage die, so you can generate a new one. But that new one comes with its own side effects as a result. So when you go into a psychedelic ceremony and your intention is to let go of your ego or to kill your ego even, well, your belief systems will automatically engineer the killing of your ego. And so when you kill your ego, a new one is automatically going to be born, the same way new cells are born out of that death. Well, that new ego is going to be born with the awareness of where it came from. And if it came out of the death of the previous ego, it is always going to have that underlying fear that its death or annihilation will come at the hands of some outside substance in this way. And so you always have that fear of death that ends up attaching to you, not death as in terms of physical death, but in terms of identity death, which is where a lot of these different, which is why people get addicted to doing ceremonies. They keep going through this stuff because, yeah, it does open up your cellular consciousness to information. It allows you to kind of look at it from a new light, but it also dysregulates the system and kills certain aspects of you that hold on to the trauma that comes from death. In that sense. And so your new ego always has that fear of, well, if my previous self was killed at random, then my new self could be as well. And so there's a big portion of integrating the parts of you that felt like you needed those medicines in the past and allowing yourself to grow out of them and actually do the integration work. Because really what happens when you blow this apart, you're fragmenting your rational mind, especially with larger doses, and that can bring different aspects of past and future selves and different things into your awareness, which is cool, and it takes you on a consciousness journey, but the journey that it tends to take you on is so far removed from physical reality that it becomes very hard for people to reintegrate into physical reality. You end up always kind of having that part of you that lives in that other dimensional spiritual reality, and you try to get back there. And so the thing that's important to recognize through this and through all these different levels is the different ways that these medicines alter that circuit and cause different beliefs and programs to show up just as a result of that. What else was I going to say about that? There's something I was going to say about that. This doesn't mean necessarily that we shouldn't ever have done those. Our consciousness goes through death and rebirth processes on its own without any substances. So the death is not the bad thing. It's just the order of events that brings that about. And so when we understand that, we can shift our personality, we can shift our regulation circuit, we can shift all these things, allowing that organically to happen in divine right order as a way of understanding that is different from blasting those things open. Now, at the same time, if we understand how that activates the different energy centers, we can use small doses of those medicines to bring in certain types of information from the cellular consciousness that deals with those energy centers. So all of that information is stored in that cellular consciousness, which we just happen to have a belief that I don't have access to my cellular consciousness, so I need to do a drug to bring it out. So if we can start to shift that belief, well, then you won't need the medicines, you won't need all of the things to help you feel connected to that information. You just need to shift the belief that you ever were disconnected from it in the first place, and start to build that, cultivate that belief in connection and the awareness that you can't be disconnected. Let me see. Let me pause for now and see what questions that my coaching clients have, what they want to dig into about this week, what's been coming up for you. If there's anything here I can apply, or, whatever else has been coming up, we can dig into.
Ryan, I have a question. So I would say before I started working with you, I had a pretty clear vision of what I wanted out of life, the business I was trying to build, all these things. And I love learning and I love observing. And so I love going through these teachings. One thing I've noticed is that I seem to have lost a lot of intention in my life around acting. I find myself observing a lot, beliefs, for example, emotions, all these things, learning a lot, and there's always more to learn, right? I mean, you've been doing this for years and, it goes on. So I'm curious about, I don't know. I'm curious about intention and
We were
having
so
clear
Andy
vision
and I
for,
were
the
talking
things
about
you want.
that.
Go ahead.
We were talking about that this morning, actually, because I was feeling the same thing. So it could be a timing thing. It's part of why I took this week off of my social media, may take the month off of my social media. Just kind of reevaluating, who am I when I'm not doing? And who am I when I'm not teaching? Who am I when I'm not creating all of that content? What else would I do? Who else am I? So part of what this consciousness evolution is a shift from being inside your business to working on your business, or the shift from being inside the matrix to being outside the matrix, working through you. So your mental aspects zoom out a little bit, and then you begin adjusting your energy, you begin adjusting your observations, you begin reevaluating how that information comes through you. And then you then have a process of balancing what you, the human, is operating on and doing and interacting with, versus what the observational aspect of you is creating through you. And most people don't yet have the observational aspect to zoom out and understand how those things are co-creating. When that first starts to activate, it's possible to feel that disconnection from your work ethic, you know, or who you were before, right? You're like, well, when I used to do this, I used to have all this motivation to just be building, making this stuff and getting things done and researching, and that research would come together in this way. And these things would happen without me needing to kind of zoom out and pay attention to it. It was just happening. Well, now your circuit is more complicated. There's more information coming through you now than what was happening before. And part of the game is you recognizing that you're really just aware of a lot more information than you were before. But also that you first were inside this human body asleep, and then you woke up and saw the body from the outside a little bit. And now you have to learn, how do I co-create both of those? And that's a learning process that happens gradually as you learn how to integrate that higher conscious aspect in real time into your actions. At the same time, you start to reveal the not enough programs that were embedded in you that were causing you to work, post. Think about your clients nonstop, to be building with this idea that you eventually get it done, then you can rest, right? We're like, okay, I'm going to activate all my consciousness so then I can rest. I'm going to do all this healing work so I can rest. I'm going to learn all this stuff and then I can rest because I know it. And these are all finite mindsets. These are all aspects of our consciousness that are evolving right now out of this finite ability to interact with our reality. So if we are infinite beings and we're growing into the awareness of that, meaning that even if the physical body dies, we don't lose that sense of who we are and what our processes are, then we also understand that the things that we interact with in our lifetimes, the things that we build, the way that we produce changes. However, the collective consciousness still operates on 40-hour work weeks, work 9 to 5. They are, they need to be working in order to be worthy. They need to be making something in order to be validated in some way. They need feedback from their clients in order to have this kind of validation. So all of those different elements are just different aspects of our consciousness that are being brought to the surface right now that we are learning how to navigate. So on one level, you're learning how to navigate the programs in you that said, well, I wish I was more intentional. I'm judging myself for what it means to be unintentional right now. Or I'm, and what that means. What does it mean to be unintentional? What does it mean to be intentional? And are you actually being intentional? You're just working on yourself. You're working on paying attention to different things. Your point of focus is different, and you're still doing that intentionally. Or are you really being unintentional? Meaning you just put a blindfold on and you're walking through your life unaware, which doesn't sound like it's true, right? So part of that game is to recognize that it's not that you're being less intentional. It's that you have a lot more information with which to be intentional. And so you're juggling a lot more information, the same like with Eric, and like the clients that are coming into him, he's juggling a lot more factors with which he can actually interact with his clients. He's realizing, oh, wait, I could just do movement with them. But now I'm realizing that if I just did movement and I'm still mentally aware of the fact that this could be a lymph issue and this could be kidneys and this could be these organs and those organs are tied to these emotions and I could do these color treatments with them, he's aware of this. And so if he's aware of that, and now he's trying to say, well, I know all these pieces and I see this human, how do I take all these pieces and start to apply them to this human? How do I start to do what people are not used to doing, which is most people are like, I teach one thing, I am a linear thinker, I'm going to go if this, then that, then that, then that, and that will work. And so then we start to take this concept that I'm teaching you that is multi-layered and interrelated. And you then have to take this multi-layered moving amorphous star system, and then you have to in real time connect these dots and then point at where to go when you work with these clients. And so it's a lot more information to navigate in real time, which is why you get the perception that you're navigating it differently. You're not navigating it necessarily differently. You're just processing information at different levels of awareness that operate on, a lot of it operates on cellular telepathy, which is how our cells communicate. is energetically and telepathically. And once you start to realize that that's how those things communicate, you start to have the other layers of telepathy start to manifest. I only mention that because we talked about telepathy the last couple of days. So yeah, so there's that.
Just recalibrating.
Yeah, you're just recalibrating.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I like the reframe even around intention, because I've had the belief system that intention is, tangible action, and it can be just as much, intention around observing myself and so on. Yeah, it's also interesting to experience like my capacity for holding information grow, but also see those limitations. Like I'll be thinking about stuff, going down a train of thought, looking at beliefs, emotions, pulling in these different things, and all of a sudden I'll hit like a boundary where I'm like, fuck, and my brain just kind of like collapses. So it's interesting to kind of hit that edge too, and how to interact with that. But yeah.
Yeah, the activations in the archive can help with the ability to hold that much information for sure. There are other ones that I might do at some point with you guys to help train that muscle. But it is, when I look at this stuff, like for me, when I do this stuff, because now I've been doing it for a while, is I'll connect multiple layers of things instantaneously and just act on it, not realizing that I connected 30 layers of things that people aren't aware of. And so my task has been, especially like through teaching this stuff and just explaining it to people in general in conversation, is recognizing what people don't know and what people can't hold in terms of information, and learning how do I keep bringing it back and keep restating it and helping as many people as I can keep up with it. Because the people who haven't done my activations or haven't done any activations or haven't done any of this work, because this is so multidimensional in concept and there's so many layers interwoven, for most of them, I would say if all you learned today was grounding, root chakra, kidneys, balanced with red and green, and you start to understand just a really specific linear aspect of that, that's a really good place to start. Eventually, you'll tie the other aspects together and see how they interrelate and how they produce noise on each other, and how there's other components within this circuit that also influence each other, how the masculine and feminine communicate and alter each other's circuit, how how to really adjust and reframe those beliefs, that kind of thing. So there's I think the reason that I'm teaching this in this way is because this circuit expands, it gets more complicated. And so I can keep expanding that in the same way that our awareness expands. And so we have at least a frame of reference for something that is tangibly real. This is literally how those circuits work. So that is tangibly real. And so we can use that as a frame of reference to build our understanding of how our energetic circuits work, because you have to realize digital technology, digital audio, power supplies, power coming from our wall, all of that was built on the framework of consciousness, not the other way around. So the more we can understand it in the reverse order by understanding these circuits and energy and whatever else from the electronic standpoint, we can reverse that and start to understand how they co-created each other in that sense.
And what I like about this framework too is it helps take some of the self-judgment out of all the shit going on in your life and all the things that you're feeling. And because I definitely struggle with that, less so after kind of like in understanding that there is a circuit, that we are a circuit, that it is a feedback mechanism, we're a regulating circuit. It becomes less, oh my gosh, so much less emotional about it, like and thinking, oh my gosh, there's this another thing that happened and blah blah blah. No, you just regulate it, like and understand that.
And that's really the game. We are, if you think of all of us as being a part of an audio component or an audio system, and we're all each components, or we're all each regulators within the orchestra signal. So there's one primary signal that's sent out to everyone, and every stage or every dimensional layer steps that frequency down. So from, it starts at 1,000,000 volts, and that steps down to 10,000 volts, and then that steps down to 1,000 volts, and then that steps down to 100 volts, and then that steps down to 12 volts, and then that steps down to 3 volts. And so we're at the 3-volt level in our circuit individually, but we're connected to the larger circuit. We're connected to all that information. But as we expand, we can handle a wider bandwidth of voltage and frequency at our input, We can become faster at adjusting our output. We become lower noise, so the resolution of our output signal is clearer. And we can trace the progress of that by understanding, okay, these are the organs, this is how my body is showing up, this is how my life is showing up. Those things like money, that's tied to the emotional center. Okay, these things like my organ function are tied to beliefs around illness, they're tied to beliefs around how they should function, they're tied to beliefs around nutrition, they're tied to beliefs around the emotions that those things are tied, those organs specifically are tied to. And so you can start to see how we can adjust those circuits at different layers, but then it takes you having the desire to dig in deeper into those specifically. So you say, okay, well, I've been having this pain in the pain in my hip, right? So I've been having this hip pain. Well, there's a couple of things that could be lined up with my hip pain. If I have, if it's near my, if it's the large intestine, let's say, that is influencing it, well, just through the examination, we can say, okay, my glutes or my hip hurts in this area. That could be tied to the large intestine. That could be tied to the kidneys. Well, the large intestine has this emotional concept of release. It also could have, if it's more kidneys than large intestine, that could be, root chakra, which would be your, could also be the core identity. So if you did psychedelics and you're running a lot of stress through the psychedelic energy that's coming through, and your rational mind is referencing, the wrong ground, well, you don't have a point of focus. You don't have your identity anchored in. So if your identity isn't anchored in and your ground is not anchored in, you're basically generating frequency in all kinds of directions. You're not focusing. You're not having a healthy body. All those kinds of things start to happen as a result of having poor or being ungrounded. That shows up as it manifests in the kidneys. It'll probably show up in the liver, and that kind of thing. And we can start to just keep tracing that up. Liver, okay, is what is the emotion on the liver? Liver is anger, I think. Gallbladder is anger, or it's frustration. What is it? Do you know what anger is, or what the liver emotion is?
I'm fried.
I'm drawing a blank off the top of my head. Scott had mentioned, though the circuit metaphor is very tangible and allows us to understand all of these components and how they work, these things are 3D or even multidimensional fields, really. Even in 3D interrelated wave fields of solitons that communicate and roll up and roll out and reflect back. So yes. So one of the things we want to understand is that everything in our body is multidimensional, but it is also three-dimensional. So we have a three-dimensional mirror of the multidimensional aspect. Like it's not, so it would not be accurate to say that we do not have physical organs. We do have physical organs because they're the physical manifestation of the cellular memory that holds that emotional imprint, that holds that particular structure. That is a multidimensional framework in the sense that it operates with the other dimensional realities that we exist in, the other, our whole 15-dimensional spectrum. Some of that 15-dimensional spectrum deals with the signal, the frequency coming in. Some of that dimensional spectrum deals with aspects of the physical body regulator system, the nodile capsule, and the electromagnetic fields that the body generates. Well, what tells the body what kind of electromagnetic field to generate? The electrical current flowing through the body and the rhythm that flows through. So when you have a conductor and you have a signal traveling through that conductor, the electricity generating through the conductor and the frequency of that electricity is going to generate a magnetic field. Well, same thing happens in us. The reason that our heartbeat generates a magnetic field is because the electrical signals that stimulate the heart has nothing to do with the heart beating itself. Or the heart organ. The heart organ is the physical manifestation of the underlying symbolic imprints and energetic imprints and things that exist on the multidimensional layers. Well, the multidimensional layers, like I said, are all built on holographic interference patterns, really. And so those frequency interference patterns overlap and build symbolic scalar wave codes or Kelon codes that form those kind of geomantic gestalts of frequency or symbolic frequency that then tells tells our cells how to organize, that tells our body how to organize, all that kind of stuff. And so we are interacting with those other layers, bringing in information, bringing in feedback, running it through our regulation circuit, and adjusting, and then constantly using those other dimensions as feedback, inward and outward, right? So our outward projection is based on the frequency that comes in and how our physiology processes that frequency through the regulation circuit. And so, but then we also get frequency from outward back inward so that we can have feedback in both directions. And we need both, otherwise we don't have a circuit, it's an incomplete circuit. What else? What other questions, comments do my coaching clients have? I know you guys had some stuff come up this week. We've talked about some of it. If you want to share any of that. This session went fast today. I must have talked about a lot.
Yeah.
Or talked a lot.
Yes.
I always get in a time warp. All right. So if you don't have any comments or questions for this week, I know we talked a lot about it in our coaching groups and stuff. And you guys messaged me.
We covered
privately.
a little ground. That's funny.
So we did a lot this week.
Fun's our life.
Yeah. Covered a little ground.
That's funny. And like I wanted to share if like as far as the ground reference, that's the stability. And as we're learning more, like as I'm learning more, I'm noticing some of my beliefs are getting a little dislodged. So my ground is like so I think Dave, you're nodding. Yeah, like that. I think it's that. And it's being, I guess, patient through that and understanding that it's just going to take a hot minute to get your footing, get your ground back to something solid. So like once my belief starts to get dislodged, I'm like, well, I don't even know what do I believe? So I can't even act based on that. And it sounds like that's where you are too, Dave. And I'm sure like all of us at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in flux. I think, so there's a lot of stuff energetically in flux, both in the collective and probably individually. But obviously we're still tied to the collective through the Earth's grids. And because of that, the belief structures that the collective holds en masse is going to influence us in a pretty strong way. And so those are also clearing. And so we're having this kind of limbo period that we're in a little bit as some of that stuff shifts, as some of those truths, so to speak, come to the surface. And as we do our own healing work within that, our resolution and noise within the structure of those other beliefs can gain some clarity. You know what's yours and what's not yours, so to speak. And that can be really helpful when we're doing a lot of this work and cleaning out our noise circuits, because healing is only step one. So once we heal, once we regulate our circuit, once we know how to use our circuit, well, then we interact with our circuit in real time. So the first step is cleaning out the beliefs that we know of and the traumas that we know of and the things that we can get to. And so that we think we've created as clean a circuit as we can. And then we begin to build, we begin to interact with our reality. And as we interact with our reality and with our relationships, we get feedback from that circuit, and then we adjust, and we create something else and we get feedback, right? And as we have higher activation with less of the dampeners put on our consciousness, meaning the collective consciousness lets go of the belief that superpowers aren't real, or that telepathy isn't real, or that any of these things are not held in that collective belief structure. Well, as those start to dissolve, our access to other information, to other abilities of consciousness begin to expand as a regulator can hold more of that frequency. And then we can play with it, right? The next step is being able to play and create with that cleanly. You're like with an audio system, the point is not to just remove all the noise and never play music through it. The point is to remove the noise so the music sounds better. And so to have more of the harmonic content as part of the music, with less artificial harmonics, basically, is what ends up happening. And there's artificial harmonics from the other negative agendas that are on the planet. There's artificial harmonics from our beliefs that haven't been examined. All that stuff gets reevaluated. And there's periods of time where you feel like you're more noise than signal, just because there's a lot to shift and there's a lot of stuff being dug up. But the more we understand how color fits into this, we can start to regulate those different levels of the circuit, bring things that are, do different tests that I've taught to assess, and then find which things need to be brought up or down. Like the endocrine treatment, obviously that one works on insufficiency, but you can also do that same treatment where these are overactive. So you can use blue instead of orange to downregulate some of those signals. And all of these different signals have reflex zones. So all the different reflex zones for the organs, they map out on the feet, they map out on the hands, they map out on the forehead, they map out on the lower back, all of those different reflex zones. And then you understand the colors that they associate with, you can start to really adjust that and bring to the surface the programs that you might not have been consciously aware of.
And with the colors, you never said this out loud, so I don't, they are complementary colors. So if you know any color theory, they are opposite on the color wheel. So in each pair you have a warm color like red, orange, yellow, and in each pair you have a cool color, green, blue, purple, violet, whatever, and then they match up. So if you have never looked at a color wheel and just want to see how that all, they're just opposites. They're opposite on there. Looky here. Right?
And that's how all the color puncture stuff is done too.
And that's balance.
Yeah, they're all, and all the balancing treatments. I don't know if I have too many of them in my program, but there's a lot of treatments that use balancing colors that you test the points and you balance from left to right. Well, you can also balance in general. So if they're overactive, you can cool them down. If they're underactive, you bring them up. And a lot of those treatments do that as well. That image that I shared with all the different organs on the back mapped out in the different colors for those. There's different colors that you would use for different organs depending on if they're overactive, if they're underactive, and you can bring them into regulation that way as well.
Yeah, I love the orchestra metaphor too. Scott said, got to tune ourselves before we can tune the whole orchestra. Fun music metaphor, we got to play without the noise. Totally, yes, I like that.
And it's funny, I taught that stuff like crazy when I was running my electronics business. And nobody, it took me so long to convince people how important noise was. Noise from the power supply. Because, as I said earlier, your system's only as good as your source. What is the source for your source? Your power supply. So if you have noise coming from the power supply, the noise in the power lines is what literally creates your signal. So, if you have toxins in your food, there's noise in your food that way, the same way. And so there are certain aspects of organs that can filter out noise innately. That's why they are designed to do that, to filter out noise. But there's also, yeah, that's good enough.
And it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to perfectly clean everything, every little iota.
But the noise, if you have noise, it's
okay.
That's the best your signal gets, right? So the goal is to remove noise from as many places as we can, so that the pure signal that we don't, we can choose our identity, we can choose our point of focus, but that determines the signal. We don't get to necessarily say, okay, I'm going to pick that signal and I want that one right now specifically. You can a little bit in certain things, but it's only because you picked your point of your identity, your point of focus, your output, and that kind of thing. And so the more we realize it, the more we realize, oh wait, I'm not in control of that aspect of it necessarily, but it always flows perfectly to match my circuit. Well, let me get my circuit as clean as possible so that I can have the best experience of that signal. Whatever that means, whether that's contrasted learning or whatever the case may be from that. So, all right, let's call that a day for today, I think. Oh, so there's a phone number you can dial in, to be able to reach. I'll share that next time. Usually I delete it out because I assume most people do it from their computer. But you should be able to dial in that way. Just message me and I'll help you out that way. All right, guys. So let's call it a day for today. And I'll keep building on these concepts a little bit more. We'll start getting into some more of the organ releases and color treatments for some of those other energy centers. And continue to tie this into this circuit so you can see, where do these things come into play. If you have specific concepts that you're working on. We can dig into certain types of beliefs and whatever other things that come up as a result of that. So just let me know. Obviously, the other thing I had mentioned last week that Mastermind Telegram that's going to be opening up. You know, if you're interested in that, you can DM me and just let me know. Like I said, that's probably not going to start until January, but that's only a couple of weeks. It'll probably come faster than we realize. So that's probably going to start in January. The archives are still open. I've had a couple of people sign up for the archives to start going through those. There's a lot of information there. So if you do sign up for the archive and you need a little bit of help on where to start, just send me a message and I'll kind of say, you know, what are you working on? Why don't you check these out first?
There's a lot of foundational stuff in there that'll help understand.
Yeah, you'll like even the activations will help you be able to grasp these chats as well. So those are all on the Freedom Teachings page. You can find those through the links in my bio, and you can message me if you can't find it. It's minsflow.com/freedom. And so you can also look, I think on that page we link to the individual sessions. So some of those are also available. I have other, they're all available. So I've done sessions on spirals. I've done sessions on organ mapping. I've done lymph sessions, all that kind of stuff. So if you're not a member of the archive, but you want one of those, you can buy those a la carte as well. If they're not there, just send me a message and I'll set it up so you can do that. And otherwise, I will talk to you over the course of the next week.
See you guys. Bye.
See you guys.